The Kentucky State Archives contain a single, water-stained document that has puzzled historians for over 170 years. Filed under Unresolved Cases, 1847, it details the mysterious disappearance of Jeremiah O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who vanished without a trace from his pig farm in Harrison County. What makes this case particularly disturbing isn't just the complete absence of a body, or the curious behavior of his wife Catherine in the weeks that followed. It's the detailed inventory list found in the county clerk's office, documenting the unusual weight gain of the O'Brien livestock during that same period, gains that defied every agricultural standard of the time. Local newspapers refused to print the full story, and the investigating sheriff's final report was sealed by court order. Tonight, we piece together the fragments of what really happened on that isolated farm, and why the truth was buried so deep that even today, mentioning the O'Brien name in certain parts of Harrison County still makes old-timers cross themselves. Before we continue with the story of Catherine O'Brien and the secret that changed everything we thought we knew about survival in 1847, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because stories like this one are exactly why we dig deep into America's darkest historical mysteries. Also, let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow mystery lovers from across the country. The trail that leads us to the truth begins not with Catherine's crime, but with her desperation, and the impossible choice that would transform an Irish immigrant woman into something far more dangerous than anyone in Kentucky could have imagined. Harrison County, Kentucky, stretched across rolling hills where morning fog clung to tobacco fields and scattered homesteads like secrets waiting to be revealed. By 1847, the county had become a refuge for Irish immigrants fleeing the Great Famine, their ships having carried them up the Ohio River to communities that promised land and opportunity. The promise, however, came with a price that many discovered too late. Catherine Flanagan had arrived in Harrison County 3 years earlier, her passage paid by a marriage contract arranged through the Catholic Church in Louisville. At 24, she possessed the kind of determined strength that comes from watching your homeland consume itself with hunger and disease. Her red hair, which she kept severely pinned beneath a worn bonnet, had earned her the nickname Fire Cat among the Irish dock workers in Louisville. But it wasn't her appearance that made men remember Catherine Flanagan. It was the way she looked at you, as if she could see exactly what you were thinking and was already 3 steps ahead. The marriage contract bound her to Jeremiah O'Brien, a man 15 years her senior who claimed to own 40 acres of good farmland and a thriving pig operation. What Catherine discovered upon her arrival was a different reality entirely. Jeremiah's thriving operation consisted of 12 underfed pigs, a collapsing barn, and a 2-room cabin that leaked when the wind blew from the west. The 40 acres were mostly rocky hillside, unsuitable for anything but grazing, and the mortgage payments were 3 months behind. Jeremiah himself proved to be an even greater disappointment than his property. A heavy-set man with prematurely gray hair and hands that shook unless he'd had his morning whiskey, he spent most days in Harrison County's growing Irish community, playing cards and drinking away whatever money Catherine managed to scrape together from selling eggs and occasional pig sales. The other Irish families whispered that Jeremiah had been different before the war, that something had happened to him during his brief service in the Mexican conflict that had turned him mean and unreliable. Catherine threw herself into salvaging what she could from the failing farm. She repaired fences with her own hands, negotiated payment plans with local merchants, and slowly began rebuilding the pig operation that represented their only hope of survival. Her neighbors, mostly established American families who viewed the Irish influx with suspicion, grudgingly admitted that Catherine O'Brien worked harder than most men. She rose before dawn to feed the animals, spent her afternoons mending equipment and cleaning the pig pens, and often worked by candlelight late into the evening, planning and calculating ways to make the farm profitable. The pigs themselves seemed to respond to Catherine's dedication. Under her care, the small herd began to flourish. She had grown up on her father's small farm in County Cork and understood animal husbandry in ways that impressed even the established farmers in the area. By late 1846, the O'Brien farm was home to 23 healthy pigs, and Catherine had established steady relationships with butchers in both Cynthiana and Georgetown. But for every dollar Catherine earned, Jeremiah found a way to spend two. His gambling debts grew larger and his drinking heavier as the success of the farm began to highlight his own failures. The other Irish men in the community started avoiding him, embarrassed by his behavior and uncomfortable with how openly he resented his wife's competence. Catherine learned to hide money from him, burying coins in mason jars beneath the cabin's floorboards and keeping careful mental records of every transaction. The tension between them escalated throughout 1846, reaching a breaking point during the harsh winter months. Jeremiah began talking obsessively about California, where gold had been discovered and where a man could start fresh. He spoke of selling the farm and heading west, despite Catherine's protests that they finally had something worth keeping. Their arguments grew louder and more frequent, disturbing the pre-dawn quiet of their isolated hollow. By early 1847, neighbors began to notice changes in both of them. Catherine had grown thinner and more guarded, her ready smile replaced by a watchful wariness that made people uncomfortable. Dark circles under her green eyes suggested sleepless nights, and she began carrying herself with the defensive posture of someone expecting an attack. Jeremiah, meanwhile, had grown increasingly erratic, showing up at the local tavern with money that no one could account for and making grandiose claims about his plans for the future. The Irish community in Harrison County was tight-knit by necessity, bound together by shared language, religion, and the constant awareness that they were unwelcome outsiders in a predominantly American county. But even within this close community, the O'Briens were becoming isolated. Catherine's pride prevented her from seeking help, while Jeremiah's behavior had alienated most of their potential allies. Father Michael O'Connell, the traveling priest who served the scattered Irish Catholic families, later testified that he had visited the O'Brien farm twice during the early months of 1847. He described Catherine as deeply troubled, and noted that she had asked specific questions about the church's position on self-defense and the protection of property. When pressed about these conversations years later, Father O'Connell would only say that he had advised Catherine to pray for guidance and to remember that God sees all things, even those done in darkness. The farm itself sat at the end of a winding dirt road that split off from the main route between Cynthiana and Millersburg. Dense woods surrounded the property on three sides, providing natural privacy that Catherine had initially welcomed but now found isolating. The nearest neighbors, the Kellerman family, lived nearly a mile away across difficult terrain. On quiet nights, sounds from the O'Brien farm rarely carried beyond the immediate hollow, a fact that would later prove significant to investigators trying to reconstruct the events of March 1847. As winter gave way to spring, the pigs grew fat and healthy under Catherine's continued care. She had expanded the operation to 29 animals and had begun making plans for a major sale that would finally put the farm on solid financial footing. Local butchers had expressed interest in purchasing the entire herd, and Catherine calculated that the sale would not only pay off their debts, but provide enough capital to properly repair the barn and expand the operation further. It was during this period of cautious optimism that Catherine discovered the documents that would change everything. Hidden in an old tobacco tin beneath Jeremiah's side of their bed, she found correspondence with a land speculator in Louisville, detailing negotiations for the sale of their entire property. The letters revealed that Jeremiah had been secretly planning to sell the farm for months, intending to take the money and disappear west while leaving Catherine with nothing. March 15, 1847, dawned gray and humid, with the kind of oppressive atmosphere that locals claimed always preceded trouble. Catherine had risen before sunrise, as was her custom, to feed the pigs and check on a sow that was expected to farrow within days. The morning mist hung thick between the trees, muffling sound and creating an otherworldly quiet that seemed to press against her ears. She had spent most of the previous night awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to Jeremiah's labored breathing beside her. The confrontation was inevitable. She could no longer pretend ignorance of his plans to sell the farm. The documents she had found detailed not just the property sale, but also Jeremiah's arrangements to travel to California with another man's wife, a young widow named Mary Brennan from the Irish settlement in Georgetown. The betrayal cut deeper than Catherine had expected. She had sacrificed everything to build something from the ruins of Jeremiah's failures, working herself to exhaustion while he drank away their future. Now he planned to sell that future and abandon her with nothing, not even the legal right to contest the sale. Under Kentucky law, a wife had no claim to property held in her husband's name, regardless of her contributions to its value. As Catherine moved through her morning chores, feeding the eager pigs and collecting eggs from the small chicken coop, she felt a strange calm settling over her. The decision had been made during the long, sleepless hours before dawn. She could not let Jeremiah destroy everything she had built, everything that represented her only hope of survival in a country that offered no protection to abandoned wives. Jeremiah emerged from the cabin around 10 o'clock, already unsteady from his morning whiskey. His shirt was stained and wrinkled, his gray hair uncombed, and his eyes carried the bloodshot look of a man who had been drinking heavily for weeks. He mumbled something about riding into town and headed toward the small stable where they kept their single horse, an aging mare named Bridget. "We need to talk, Jeremiah." Catherine's voice stopped him mid-stride. She stood beside the pig pen, holding a bucket of kitchen scraps, her red hair visible beneath her bonnet despite her attempts to keep it pinned back. Something in her tone made him turn around, and for a moment, his whiskey-dulled eyes sharpened with suspicion. "Talk about what?" he asked, though the way he avoided her gaze suggested he already knew. Catherine set down the bucket and reached into her apron pocket, withdrawing the letters she had found. She held them up without speaking, watching as recognition and then anger flashed across his weathered face. "You had no right to go through my things," he said, his words slightly slurred but his voice gaining strength. "Those are private papers. Private plans to sell my farm and run off with that Brennan woman," Catherine replied, her own voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. 3 years of work, Jeremiah. 3 years of making something from nothing while you drank yourself stupid every night. It's my farm." Jeremiah stepped closer, his hands clenching into fists. "My name on the deed, my signature on the mortgage. You're just the wife, Catherine. You don't own nothing." The words hit her like physical blows, but Catherine forced herself to remain calm. She had known this moment would come, had prepared for it during the long night hours when sleep refused to come. "I won't let you do it," she said simply. Jeremiah's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You won't let me? You think you have some kind of say in this?" He moved closer still, close enough that Catherine could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the cruel gleam in his eyes that had become increasingly familiar over the past months. "I already signed the papers, woman. McReynolds is coming tomorrow to finalize everything. By next week I'll be on my way to California and you can figure out your own way to survive." "What about the pigs?" Catherine asked, gesturing toward the pen where 29 healthy animals milled about, grunting contentedly. "What about everything we've built here?" "We didn't build nothing," Jeremiah snarled. "You did the work while I was supposed to be grateful for a wife who acts like she's the man of the house. Well, I'm done being grateful, Catherine. I'm done pretending this marriage was anything but a mistake." He raised his hand as if to strike her, a gesture that had become more frequent in recent weeks. But this time, Catherine didn't step back. Instead, she looked at him with an expression of cold calculation that made him hesitate. "You're not leaving, Jeremiah," she said quietly. Something in her tone penetrated his whiskey-fogged brain, and for the first time in the conversation, he looked genuinely uncertain. "What are you talking about?" "I said you're not leaving." Catherine's voice remained calm, but her green eyes had taken on a hardness that Jeremiah had never seen before. "This farm is staying in the family, and you're staying with it." Jeremiah's uncertain expression shifted back to anger, fueled by alcohol and wounded pride. "You can't stop me, woman. You're nothing but an Irish peasant who should be grateful any man would take you." He lunged toward her then, his hand raised to deliver the blow he had been threatening. But Catherine was ready. As his arm came down, she stepped aside and grabbed the heavy wooden feeding ladle from the bucket at her feet. The movement was smooth and practiced, as if she had rehearsed it many times in her mind. The ladle caught Jeremiah across the temple with a solid, meaty sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. He stumbled backward, his eyes widening with surprise more than pain, and for a moment Catherine thought he might simply fall and end the confrontation. Instead, he steadied himself against the fence post and touched his fingers to his head, staring at the blood that came away on his hand. "You crazy bitch," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "You actually hit me." "I warned you," Catherine replied, still holding the ladle. Her heart was pounding, but her voice remained steady. "I told you that you weren't leaving." Jeremiah straightened up, wiping blood from his forehead, and Catherine could see the exact moment when his shock transformed into genuine rage. His face darkened and his hands began to shake with something more than his usual whiskey tremors. "You're going to regret that," he said, moving toward her with slow, deliberate steps. "I'm going to teach you what happens to wives who forget their place." But as he approached, Catherine noticed something that made her blood run cold. In his right hand, Jeremiah was gripping the sharp metal hook they used for moving hay bales, a tool that could easily kill if wielded with sufficient force. His intention was clear in his eyes, and Catherine realized with crystalline clarity that this confrontation would end with one of them dead. The next few moments unfolded with the strange, slow-motion quality that people describe in moments of extreme crisis. Catherine saw Jeremiah raise the hay hook above his head, his face twisted with murderous intent. She saw the morning light glinting off the metal, and she smelled the familiar scent of pig manure and wet earth that would forever be associated with this moment in her memory. She also saw, with perfect clarity, exactly what she needed to do to survive. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the gentle grunting of pigs and the distant sound of water dripping from the cabin's damaged roof. Catherine stood motionless for nearly 5 minutes, staring down at Jeremiah's still form sprawled beside the pig pen. The hay hook lay several feet away, where it had fallen from his lifeless fingers, its metal surface now dulled with moisture from the morning air. Blood pooled beneath his head, dark and thick in the muddy ground, but Catherine noticed with detached observation that there was less of it than she might have expected. The second blow with the feeding ladle had caught him directly behind the left ear as he fell from the first strike, and the combination had killed him almost instantly. His eyes stared sightlessly at the grey sky, and his mouth hung open in permanent surprise. Catherine's hands were shaking now, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation giving way to the reality of what she had done. She dropped the wooden ladle and wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the trembling that seemed to originate in her bones. The magnitude of her situation began to settle over her like a suffocating blanket. She was alone on an isolated farm with her husband's corpse and no witnesses to testify that she had acted in self-defense. Even if there had been witnesses, Kentucky law provided little protection for women who killed their husbands, regardless of the circumstances. The courts would assume that Jeremiah, as the man and the property owner, had been within his rights to discipline his wife as he saw fit. Catherine's word against a dead man would carry no weight with a jury of American men who already viewed Irish immigrants with suspicion. The practical problem seemed almost as overwhelming as the legal ones. Jeremiah weighed nearly 200 pounds, and Catherine had no way to move his body without help she couldn't afford to seek. She couldn't simply leave him where he lay. The Kellerman children sometimes wandered over from the neighboring farm, and the traveling priest was expected sometime within the next few weeks. She couldn't bury him alone, even if she could find a way to explain his sudden absence to the community. As Catherine stood in the morning mist, trying to think clearly despite her racing heart, She became aware of movement around her. The pigs had gathered near the fence, drawn by the scent of blood and the disruption in their usual routine. Their small, intelligent eyes watched her with what seemed like expectant interest, and several of the larger boars had begun making the low, rumbling sounds they typically made when anticipating food. The idea came to her gradually, emerging from the practical knowledge she had gained during 3 years of intensive pig farming. Pigs, she knew, would eat almost anything organic. They were omnivores with powerful jaws and efficient digestive systems, capable of consuming and completely processing bones, hair, and even teeth. Irish farmers had long known that pigs could dispose of organic waste more thoroughly than any other method available to rural households. The thought should have horrified her. Instead, Catherine found herself considering the logistics with the same calm efficiency she brought to all farm problems. The pigs were hungry. She had delayed their morning feeding because of the confrontation with Jeremiah. They were accustomed to kitchen scraps and occasional treats, and they had never shown any hesitation about consuming meat when it was offered. Catherine walked slowly around Jeremiah's body, studying the problem from different angles. The pig pen was large enough to accommodate what needed to be done, and the fence was tall enough to prevent neighbors from seeing inside, even if they happened to pass by. The nearest farm was far enough away that any sounds would be attributed to normal pig feeding activities, especially since she regularly fed them around this time of day. The most challenging aspect would be moving the body, but Catherine had been handling heavy feed sacks and wrestling with large pigs for 3 years. She was stronger than most women, and desperation would provide additional strength. She could drag Jeremiah to the pen in sections if necessary, though the thought of dismembering him made her stomach turn. As she considered the plan, Catherine realized that it solved multiple problems simultaneously. It would eliminate the body completely, leaving no evidence of what had occurred. It would allow her to maintain the fiction that Jeremiah had simply left for California as he had planned, which would explain his absence without raising immediate suspicions. And it would feed her pigs, which represented the most valuable asset she owned and her only hope of economic survival. The decision, once made, filled Catherine with a sense of calm purpose that surprised her. She had always been practical by necessity, and this was simply another problem that required a practical solution. The moral implications seemed distant and unreal compared to the immediate need to protect herself and preserve the life she had built. Catherine returned to the cabin and changed into her oldest work dress, one that was already stained and patched from farm labor. She gathered the tools she would need: several sharp knives from the kitchen, a length of rope, and an old canvas tarp that they had used for covering machinery. She also retrieved a bottle of whiskey from Jeremiah's private supply, taking a long drink to steady her nerves before beginning the work ahead. The physical task proved to be as difficult as she had anticipated, but Catherine approached it with the same methodical determination she brought to all farm chores. She worked steadily through the morning and into the early afternoon, pausing frequently to rest and to ensure that no one was approaching the farm. The pigs, initially excited by the unusual activity, settled into contented feeding as Catherine provided them with more substantial meals than they had enjoyed in months. By evening, there was no trace of Jeremiah O'Brien except for a dark stain in the mud beside the pig pen, which Catherine covered with fresh hay and pig manure. She burned his clothing and personal effects in the cabin's fireplace, mixing the ashes with ordinary wood ash to eliminate any distinctive remains. The tools she had used were cleaned thoroughly and returned to their normal storage places. Catherine spent that night awake, sitting beside the fireplace and thinking through every aspect of what she had done. She felt no remorse for killing Jeremiah. He had intended to kill her, and she had simply acted faster. The disposal of his body was more troubling to her moral sensibilities, but she recognized it as a necessary evil if she wanted to survive. Over the following days, Catherine began implementing the cover story she had developed. She told neighbors that Jeremiah had left for California to investigate opportunities there, and that he would send for her once he was established. The story was consistent with his known plans and his increasingly frequent absences from the farm. Most neighbors accepted the explanation without question, though some expressed surprise that he had left without saying goodbye. Father O'Connell visited the farm 2 weeks after Jeremiah's disappearance and asked pointed questions about the sudden departure. Catherine maintained her story, explaining that her husband had been excited about gold prospects in California and had left impulsively when an opportunity arose to travel with other men heading west. The priest seemed skeptical, but had no grounds for pressing the matter further. The most challenging aspect of maintaining the deception was managing Jeremiah's financial obligations. Catherine discovered that his gambling debts were even larger than she had realized, and several creditors began demanding immediate payment once word spread that he had left town. She was forced to sell most of the pig herd earlier than planned, using the money to settle his debts and maintain the appearance that she was simply managing affairs until his return. But the pigs she kept, those that had helped her solve her most pressing problem, thrived under her continued care. They grew larger and healthier than any livestock in the county, developing a reputation among local farmers for their exceptional size and vigor. Catherine attributed their success to her improved feeding methods, which was, in a sense, entirely accurate. Spring turned to summer, and Catherine O'Brien settled into a routine that felt both familiar and entirely transformed. Without Jeremiah's drinking and gambling to drain their resources, the farm began to prosper in ways she had only dreamed of during their troubled marriage. She kept 8 of her best pigs and used the money from selling the others to make substantial improvements to the property. The cabin's roof was repaired, and Catherine added a small extension that served as a proper kitchen and storage area. She rebuilt sections of fencing and constructed a new, larger pig pen that allowed her animals more space to roam. Most importantly, she was able to make the final payment on the farm's mortgage, securing her legal ownership of the property for the first time. The transformation didn't go unnoticed by her neighbors. Mary Kellerman, whose family lived on the adjacent farm, commented to other women in the community that Catherine seemed like a completely different person since Jeremiah's departure. The perpetual worry lines around her eyes had faded, and she had regained the weight she had lost during the final difficult months of her marriage. She smiled more readily and spoke with a confidence that many found refreshing in a woman. But there were also changes that made some people uncomfortable. Catherine had developed a reputation for fierce protectiveness regarding her remaining pigs, refusing to sell them despite offers that exceeded their market value by substantial margins. She claimed they were breeding stock essential to her future plans, but the intensity of her attachment struck some observers as unusual. She spent hours each day tending to the animals, talking to them in Irish Gaelic and treating them with a level of care typically reserved for family pets. Local farmers also began to notice the exceptional size and health of Catherine's pigs. By midsummer, even the youngest animals in her herd were notably larger than comparable pigs on other farms. Their coats were shinier, their behavior more energetic, and their overall condition suggested nutrition far superior to what most farmers could provide. Catherine attributed their success to a special feeding mixture she had developed, but she was secretive about the exact ingredients and refused to share her methods with other farmers. The mystery deepened when Thomas McReynolds, the land speculator who had been negotiating to purchase the O'Brien farm, arrived in Harrison County in late June to complete the transaction. McReynolds was a well-dressed man from Louisville who made his living buying farm properties from struggling immigrants and reselling them to more established American families at substantial profits. He had been corresponding with Jeremiah for several months and expected to find him ready to finalize the sale. Instead, McReynolds found Catherine firmly established on the property and claiming that her husband had changed his mind about selling. She produced a letter, supposedly written by Jeremiah from California, instructing her to cancel the sale and maintain the farm until his return. The letter was written in Jeremiah's handwriting and included details that seemed to verify its authenticity, but something about the situation made McReynolds suspicious. "I've been in business for 15 years, McReynolds told other men at the tavern in Cynthiana. "And I've never seen a man change his mind so completely about a deal like this." Jeremiah O'Brien was desperate to get to California. He talked about nothing else for months. Now suddenly he wants to keep the farm he was so eager to sell. McReynolds spent several days in the county, asking questions and trying to verify Catherine's story. He learned that no one had actually seen Jeremiah leave for California. Catherine claimed he had departed very early one morning while she was still sleeping. No one in the local Irish community had heard from him since his supposed departure, which was unusual for a man who had been gregarious despite his flaws. Most troubling to McReynolds was the discovery that Jeremiah's horse was still in the stable, which seemed inconsistent with a planned journey to California. When McReynolds confronted Catherine with these discrepancies, she remained calm and provided reasonable explanations for each concern. Jeremiah had left on foot to meet other travelers in Georgetown, she explained, planning to purchase a horse and supplies there before beginning the westward journey. He had always been poor at maintaining correspondence, and his silence was consistent with his generally thoughtless nature. The letter she had received had been carried by another Irish immigrant returning from California, which explained why it bore no postal markings. McReynolds remained skeptical, but he had no legal grounds for challenging Catherine's claims. The supposed letter from Jeremiah clearly cancelled their agreement, and Catherine had paid off the farm's mortgage, establishing her legal right to the property. After a week of frustrated investigation, McReynolds returned to Louisville, but he left behind a network of contacts who continued to watch the O'Brien farm with interest. Meanwhile, Catherine faced a different kind of scrutiny from the Irish community. Father O'Connell had received disturbing reports about changes in her behavior and attitude since Jeremiah's departure. Several women claimed that Catherine had become hard and calculating in ways that seemed inappropriate for a woman in her situation. She no longer attended the informal gatherings where Irish women shared news and supported each other through difficulties. She had stopped participating in community work projects and rarely visited with neighbors except when necessary for business. More troubling were reports about Catherine's relationship with her pigs. Children who lived near the farm claimed they had seen her talking to the animals for hours at a time, sometimes in English, but often in Irish Gaelic, that even other Irish speakers found difficult to understand. She had been observed feeding them at unusual hours, often late at night or very early in the morning, and the quantities of food she provided seemed excessive for the number of animals she kept. Father O'Connell decided to visit the farm again in early August, ostensibly to check on Catherine's spiritual well-being, but actually to investigate the growing rumors about her behavior. He found her working in her garden, which had expanded significantly since his last visit, and now included vegetables and herbs he didn't recognize. Catherine greeted him politely, but with none of the warmth typically shown to visiting clergy by Irish Catholic women. "I've been concerned about you, my child," Father O'Connell said as they walked toward the cabin. "Living alone on this isolated farm can't be easy for a young woman." "I'm managing quite well, Father," Catherine replied. "Better than I ever did when Jeremiah was here, to be honest." The priest was struck by the hardness in her voice when she spoke her husband's name. There was no affection there, no sadness at his absence, just a cold dismissal that seemed inconsistent with normal grief patterns. "Have you heard from your husband recently?" he asked. "Not directly, but I know he's well," Catherine said. "He's probably too busy with gold prospecting to write letters." Father O'Connell noticed that Catherine avoided looking at him as she spoke, focusing instead on the pig pen where her animals were gathered near the fence. The pigs themselves were indeed remarkable, larger and healthier than any he had seen in Kentucky. But there was something unsettling about the way they watched Catherine, almost as if they were expecting something from her. "Some of your neighbors are concerned about you," the priest continued. "They say you've become withdrawn from the community." "I have work to do," Catherine replied simply. "The farm doesn't run itself, and I can't afford to waste time on gossip and socializing." As they talked, Father O'Connell became increasingly uncomfortable. Catherine's responses were technically appropriate, but her manner suggested someone who was hiding significant information. Her body language was defensive, and she frequently glanced toward the pig pen as if worried about something there. Most disturbing was her complete lack of emotion when discussing her husband's absence. She showed no loneliness, no concern for his welfare, no anticipation of his return. Before leaving, Father O'Connell asked to see the letter Catherine claimed to have received from Jeremiah. She produced it readily enough, and the handwriting did appear to match other documents the priest had seen Jeremiah sign. But something about the letter's tone bothered him. It was too detailed in some ways and too vague in others, as if the writer had been trying very hard to sound like someone else. That evening, Father O'Connell confided his concerns to Patrick Kellerman, one of the more established Irish farmers in the area. "There's something wrong at the O'Brien farm," he said. "I can't put my finger on it exactly, but that woman is hiding something significant." Kellerman nodded thoughtfully. His own family had noticed changes in Catherine's behavior, and his children had reported strange sounds coming from the O'Brien property during nighttime hours. "Should we contact the sheriff?" he asked. "On what grounds?" Father O'Connell replied. "She claims her husband is alive and well in California. She's committed no observable crime, but I fear—" He paused, struggling to articulate his concerns. "I fear that something terrible has happened, and we're all going to wish we had acted sooner." August brought an unseasonable drought to Harrison County, and with it came the kind of desperate conditions that reveal the true nature of both land and people. Creek beds that had run freely since spring began to dry up, leaving only stagnant pools that bred mosquitoes and disease. Gardens withered despite farmers' best efforts, and the usual summer abundance gave way to growing anxiety about winter preparations. Catherine O'Brien's farm, however, seemed mysteriously immune to the drought's effects. While her neighbors watched their crops fail and their livestock grow thin, her garden flourished with an almost supernatural vigor. Her pigs remained fat and healthy, showing none of the stress that affected animals throughout the county. The contrast was so stark that people began to talk openly about her apparent good fortune. "It's not natural," complained Sarah Brennan, whose own farm was struggling despite her family's years of experience. "Nobody's pigs look that good during a drought year. She's got to be getting feed from somewhere, but where? And how's she paying for it?" The questions multiplied when people realized that Catherine had made no purchases of additional feed from any of the usual suppliers in Cynthiana or Georgetown. Local merchants confirmed that she hadn't bought grain, corn, or any other pig feed since early summer. Yet her animals continued to thrive and grow, developing into some of the finest specimens anyone in the county had ever seen. Thomas McReynolds returned to Harrison County in late August, this time accompanied by a young lawyer from Louisville named Jonathan Hayes. McReynolds had remained convinced that something was wrong with Catherine's story about her husband's departure, and he hoped that Hayes might find legal grounds to challenge her ownership of the property. The two men spent several days investigating, interviewing neighbors, and reviewing property records at the county courthouse. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. Several neighbors mentioned that they had never actually seen Jeremiah leave for California. They only had Catherine's word that he had departed. His horse was still in the stable, which seemed inconsistent with a planned journey to the west. Most puzzling was the timing of various financial transactions that had occurred immediately after Jeremiah's supposed departure. "Look at this," Hayes said, spreading documents across the table in his hotel room. 3 days after Catherine claims her husband left for California, she paid off the entire remaining balance on their mortgage. Where did that money come from? McReynolds studied the paperwork. She says she sold most of their pigs, but the timing doesn't make sense. How could she organize a sale that quickly, especially with Jeremiah supposedly gone? Hayes had also uncovered evidence of Jeremiah's gambling debts, which had been substantial and growing larger throughout the winter of 1846. Multiple creditors were demanding immediate payment, he noted. Then, suddenly, within 2 weeks of his supposed departure, every debt was settled in full. Again, where did the money come from? The lawyers decided to confront Catherine directly with their questions. They arrived at the farm on a sweltering afternoon in late August, finding her working in her impossibly green garden while the rest of the county baked under relentless sun. Catherine greeted them politely, but with obvious wariness, especially when she recognized McReynolds. "Mrs. O'Brien," Hayes began, "we're investigating some irregularities regarding your husband's business affairs. We'd like to ask you a few questions." "My husband's business is his own concern," Catherine replied, continuing to tend her plants. "I don't involve myself in such matters." "But you did involve yourself in paying off his debts," McReynolds interjected, "and in settling the mortgage. That required substantial sums of money, Mrs. O'Brien, money that had to come from somewhere." Catherine straightened up, brushing dirt from her hands with deliberate slowness. "I sold pigs, as I've explained before. Jeremiah left me with instructions about settling his affairs before he departed." "You sold 21 pigs in less than a week," Hayes said, consulting his notes, "to buyers that no one in the county can identify. Don't you find that unusual?" "I find it unusual that grown men have so little to occupy their time that they spend it questioning a woman about her private business," Catherine replied, her green eyes flashing with anger. "My husband authorized those sales before he left. The buyers were traveling merchants heading toward Louisville. I don't see why any of this should concern you, Mr. McReynolds, since Jeremiah canceled your agreement." McReynolds stepped closer, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone. "Because I don't believe your husband ever left for California, Mrs. O'Brien. I think something happened to him right here on this farm." The accusation hung in the hot air between them like a challenge. Catherine's expression didn't change, but Hayes noticed that her hands had begun to tremble slightly. Behind her, the remaining pigs had gathered near the fence, watching the confrontation with what seemed like unusual interest. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. McReynolds," Catherine said quietly. "Do you have any evidence to support it?" "I have evidence that your story doesn't make sense," McReynolds replied. "I have evidence that you paid debts with money that seemingly appeared from nowhere. I have evidence that no one actually saw your husband leave. And I have a letter from my husband confirming that he arrived safely in California," Catherine countered. "I have witnesses who can confirm that he spoke frequently about traveling west. I have documentation of legal business transactions that are none of your concern." Hayes decided to try a different approach. "Mrs. O'Brien, we're not trying to cause you trouble, but if something happened to your husband, even accidentally, it would be better to tell the truth now than to let suspicions continue to grow." Catherine looked at him with an expression of cold amusement. "Are you suggesting that I harmed my husband, Mr. Hayes? A woman my size against a man like Jeremiah?" "I'm suggesting that accidents happen," Hayes replied carefully, "and sometimes people panic and make poor decisions about how to handle them. The only poor decision I see here," Catherine said, "is grown men wasting their time harassing a widow trying to manage her farm during a drought." She gestured toward her thriving garden and healthy pigs. "As you can see, I'm quite capable of taking care of myself and my property." McReynolds followed her gesture, and his eyes settled on the pig pen with growing suspicion. The animals were indeed remarkably healthy, larger than any pigs he had seen in Kentucky. "Those are fine animals, Mrs. O'Brien. What do you feed them to keep them so healthy during such a difficult year?" "Kitchen scraps, garden waste, and careful attention," Catherine replied, "plus some feeding methods I learned from my father in Ireland." "Must be quite special methods," Hayes observed. "I've never seen pigs thrive like that during a drought." Catherine's smile was thin and cold. Perhaps Kentucky farmers could learn something from Irish techniques. As the men prepared to leave, clearly frustrated by Catherine's responses, Hayes noticed something that made him pause. Near the corner of the pig pen, partially hidden by hay, was what appeared to be a piece of metal. When he looked more closely, he realized it was a man's belt buckle, tarnished and dirty but still recognizable. "Mrs. O'Brien," he said casually, "you might want to clean up around your pig pen. There's some debris there that could injure the animals." Catherine followed his gaze and saw the buckle immediately. For just a moment her composure cracked, and Hayes saw something that looked like genuine fear flash across her face, but she recovered quickly. "Thank you for pointing that out," she said. "I'll take care of it." As McReynolds and Hayes walked back toward their carriage, they could hear Catherine behind them, moving around the pig pen and making soft noises to her animals. The sounds were oddly intimate, almost like a conversation, and both men found themselves walking faster without quite knowing why. "Did you see how she reacted to that belt buckle?" Hayes asked once they were out of earshot. "I saw," McReynolds replied grimly, "and I think we both know whose buckle that was." That evening, the two men met with Father O'Connell and Patrick Kellerman to discuss their growing suspicions. The priest had been keeping his own careful watch on Catherine's behavior and had documented several incidents that seemed inconsistent with her claims about Jeremiah's welfare. "She's been burning things," Father O'Connell reported. "Large fires late at night, much more than would be needed for normal household waste. And the children have reported seeing her working in the pig pen after dark, which seems unusual." Kellerman nodded gravely. "My youngest boy swears he saw her talking to those pigs like they were people. Said it gave him nightmares because she seemed to be thanking them for something." Hayes leaned forward, his legal mind processing the implications. "Gentlemen, I think we need to consider the possibility that Catherine O'Brien killed her husband and disposed of his body in a way that would leave no trace." "You mean," McReynolds began, his face pale. "I mean those pigs are as healthy as they are because they've been fed more than kitchen scraps," Hayes said quietly. "And I think we all know what that means." The group sat in horrified silence as the full implications of Hayes's suggestion settled over them. It was Father O'Connell who finally spoke, his voice heavy with dread. "If what you're suggesting is true, then we're dealing with something far more terrible than a simple murder. We're dealing with a woman who has committed an act so unspeakable that even speaking of it feels like a sin." McReynolds cleared his throat. "The question now is what we do about it. We can't prove anything, and accusing a woman of what we're thinking without solid evidence would be disastrous. We need the sheriff," Kellerman said firmly. "This has gone beyond what we can handle ourselves." But Hayes shook his head. "The sheriff will want evidence, and we don't have any. All we have are suspicions and a belt buckle that could have belonged to anyone." As the men debated their next steps, none of them noticed the figure watching them from the shadows outside the tavern. Catherine O'Brien had followed them into town, moving silently through the darkness with the skill of someone who had learned to be very careful about being observed. She had heard enough of their conversation to know that her carefully constructed deception was beginning to unravel. The belt buckle had been a careless mistake, one that could lead to questions she couldn't answer. More importantly, she now knew that multiple people suspected the truth about Jeremiah's fate. Standing in the darkness, Catherine made a decision that would determine whether she survived the growing investigation or joined her husband in an unmarked grave. The men inside the tavern thought they were hunting her, but they had no idea how dangerous their prey had become. Catherine smiled grimly as she made her way back to the farm through the moonless night. Tomorrow, she would take steps to ensure that their suspicions never became proof. After all, she had learned many things about disposal and concealment over the past few months, and if necessary, she was prepared to expand her methods beyond just pigs. Sheriff William Hartwell arrived in Harrison County on September 3, 1847, responding to formal complaints filed by McReynolds and Hayes regarding the suspicious disappearance of Jeremiah O'Brien. Hartwell was a practical man in his 50s who had served as sheriff for over a decade, dealing primarily with property disputes, minor thefts, and the occasional violent altercation between neighbors. He approached the O'Brien case with skepticism, viewing it as likely nothing more than a domestic dispute that had gotten out of hand. But Hartwell was also thorough, and he spent his first day reviewing all available documentation and interviewing the men who had brought the complaint. The accumulation of small inconsistencies in Catherine's story, combined with the suspicious timing of various financial transactions, convinced him that a formal investigation was warranted. Catherine received word of the sheriff's arrival, through the Irish community's informal network, which meant she had nearly 6 hours to prepare before Hartwell appeared at her farm on the morning of September 4th. She used that time carefully, burning several items in her fireplace and making subtle adjustments to the pig pen that would eliminate any remaining physical evidence of what had occurred there months earlier. When Sheriff Hartwell knocked on her cabin door, Catherine greeted him with the same polite wariness she had shown McReynolds and Hayes. She invited him inside for coffee and answered his initial questions about Jeremiah's departure with the same explanations she had been providing for months. "Mrs. O'Brien," Hartwell said, setting down his coffee cup, "I need to ask you some specific questions about your husband's business affairs. There are some irregularities that concern me." "I'm happy to help however I can, Sheriff," Catherine replied, though her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "Though I'm afraid I don't know much about Jeremiah's business dealings." Hartwell consulted his notes. "You paid off your mortgage and several substantial debts immediately after your husband's departure. The total amount was approximately $800, which represents a significant sum of money. Can you explain where those funds came from?" "I sold most of our pigs to traveling merchants," Catherine said. "Jeremiah had arranged the sale before he left." "I've been unable to locate any of these merchants," Hartwell said. "No one in Cynthiana or Georgetown recalls seeing such a large pig sale, and no one can identify the buyers you mentioned." Catherine's composure remained steady, but Hartwell noticed that she had begun smoothing her skirt repeatedly with her hands, a nervous gesture that suggested stress. "They were passing through from Louisville, heading toward Lexington," she said. "I didn't think to ask for their names or businesses. $800 worth of pigs represents a substantial transaction, Mrs. O'Brien. Most farmers would remember specific details about such a significant sale." "I was overwhelmed by Jeremiah's departure and handling his affairs," Catherine replied. "I may not recall every detail perfectly." Hartwell stood and walked to the window that faced the pig pen, where Catherine's remaining animals were visible in the morning sunlight. "Those are remarkable pigs you still have," he observed. "I've never seen animals maintain such condition during a drought year." "I take good care of them," Catherine said, joining him at the window. "They're valuable breeding stock." "What do you feed them?" The question was casual, but Catherine hesitated just a moment too long before answering. "Kitchen scraps, garden waste, some grain when I can afford it." "Where do you purchase grain during a drought year when most suppliers are running short?" I make do with what's available," Catherine stammered, and Hartwell noted that this was the first time her answers had seemed uncertain. The sheriff turned away from the window and studied Catherine's face carefully. "Mrs. O'Brien, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to answer it honestly. Do you know where your husband is right now?" Catherine met his gaze steadily. "He's in California, as I've told everyone who's asked. And you're certain he's alive?" Something flickered in Catherine's eyes, a moment of what might have been amusement or fear. "Of course I'm certain. Why would you ask such a thing?" "Because several people have expressed concerns about the circumstances of his departure," Hartwell said, "and because some of the details in your story don't align with the evidence I've found." Catherine's hands had begun shaking slightly, and she clasped them behind her back to hide the tremor. "What evidence? What are you suggesting, Sheriff?" Hartwell reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the belt buckle that Hayes had spotted near the pig pen. He had retrieved it the previous evening while Catherine was in town, and now he placed it on the table between them. "Do you recognize this, Mrs. O'Brien?" Catherine stared at the buckle for a long moment, her face growing pale. It was distinctively carved with Jeremiah's initials and a Celtic knot pattern that made it immediately identifiable. It could be anyone's buckle," she said finally. "It was found in your pig pen, Mrs. O'Brien, and those are your husband's initials carved into the metal." The silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sounds of pigs grunting and chickens clucking in the yard. Catherine's breathing had become shallow and rapid, and Hartwell could see her calculating desperately for an explanation that would account for the buckle's presence without implicating her in anything sinister. "He must have lost it before he left," she said at last. "Jeremiah was always careless with his belongings. This buckle was partially buried under hay and pig manure," Hartwell said quietly. "It had been there for months, Mrs. O'Brien, long enough to become tarnished and corroded." Catherine's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising with desperation. "You don't know what he was like, what he was going to do to me. He was going to kill me, Sheriff. He came at me with a hay hook, ready to split my skull open because I wouldn't let him sell our farm and abandon me with nothing." The confession spilled out of her then, months of carefully maintained deception giving way to the relief of finally telling the truth. She described the confrontation with Jeremiah, his threats to kill her, and her desperate act of self-defense. But she stopped short of explaining what had happened to his body, clinging to some last hope that she might avoid the full consequences of her actions. "Where is he now, Mrs. O'Brien?" Hartwell asked, his voice gentle but implacable. Catherine looked toward the window, toward the pig pen where her animals were gathered in the morning sunshine, and Hartwell followed her gaze. Understanding dawned on his face slowly, followed by an expression of horror that he couldn't quite suppress. "Dear God," he whispered, "you didn't." "They were hungry," Catherine said, her voice flat and emotionless, "and I couldn't bury him alone. I couldn't move him, couldn't explain his absence. The pigs, they don't leave anything behind, no bones, no teeth, nothing that could be found later." Hartwell stared at her in stunned silence, struggling to process what she had just admitted. In all his years as sheriff, he had encountered murders driven by passion, greed, and desperation, but nothing had prepared him for this methodical disposal of a human being. "How many people know about this?" he asked finally. "No one," Catherine said. "Just you and me." But even as she spoke, Catherine realized that her confession had sealed her fate. Sheriff Hartwell would arrest her, and she would be tried for murder in a court system that offered no sympathy for Irish immigrants or women who killed their husbands. The fact that she had acted in self-defense would matter little compared to the horrific method she had chosen for disposing of the body. As Hartwell reached for the handcuffs on his belt, Catherine made a final, desperate decision. She lunged toward the kitchen table where she had left a large carving knife, moving with the quick desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. But Hartwell was faster. He caught her wrist before she could reach the weapon, using his superior size and strength to pin her arms behind her back. Catherine struggled briefly, then went limp in his grasp, the fight going out of her as completely as air from a punctured balloon. "Catherine O'Brien," Hartwell said formally, "you're under arrest for the murder of your husband, Jeremiah O'Brien." As he secured the handcuffs around her wrists, Catherine looked once more toward the pig pen where her animals were watching the commotion with their small, intelligent eyes. In her mind, she could hear them grunting softly, almost as if they were saying goodbye. The trial of Catherine O'Brien began on October 15, 1847, drawing crowds from across central Kentucky who came to witness what newspapers had dubbed the most shocking case in the state's history. The courthouse in Cynthiana overflowed with spectators, forcing many to stand outside and wait for updates from those inside. Catherine's confession to Sheriff Hartwell had been detailed and complete, leaving little doubt about the basic facts of the case. She had killed her husband in what she claimed was self-defense, then fed his body to her pigs to avoid detection. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Samuel Morrison, focused on the premeditated nature of the body disposal, arguing that Catherine's actions after the killing demonstrated a calculating mind rather than a woman acting in desperate panic. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Morrison declared in his opening statement, "we are not here to debate whether Jeremiah O'Brien was a good husband or whether he treated his wife poorly. We are here because Catherine O'Brien chose to commit an act so depraved, so utterly inhuman, that it challenges our very understanding of civilized behavior." Catherine's defense attorney, a young lawyer named Robert Brennan, who had taken the case partly because of his own Irish heritage, attempted to argue self-defense and temporary insanity. He painted Jeremiah as a violent drunk who had threatened his wife's life, driving her to desperate measures to protect herself. But Brennan faced an uphill battle, not only because of the shocking nature of the body disposal, but also because of widespread anti-Irish sentiment among the predominantly American jury. My client is a woman who fled starvation in Ireland, only to face violence and abandonment in Kentucky, Brennan told the jury. When faced with the choice between her own death and defending herself, she chose to live. Everything that followed was the desperate action of a woman who knew that the law offered her no protection and no justice. The trial lasted 4 days, during which numerous witnesses testified about Catherine's behavior before and after Jeremiah's disappearance. Father O'Connell provided testimony about his visits to the farm and his growing suspicions about Catherine's explanations. Patrick Kellerman described the strange sounds his children had reported hearing from the O'Brien property. McReynolds and Hayes detailed their investigation and the evidence that had led them to contact the sheriff. Perhaps the most damaging testimony came from Dr. Edmund Carlisle, a physician from Lexington who had been brought in to examine Catherine's remaining pigs. Dr. Carlisle testified that the animals showed signs of having consumed large quantities of meat over an extended period, and that their exceptional size and health were consistent with a diet far richer in protein than typical pig feed. In my professional opinion, Dr. Carlisle told the hushed courtroom, these animals have been fed substantial amounts of fresh meat over a period of several months. The quantity required to produce such effects would be consistent with the consumption of an adult human being. Catherine herself took the stand on the final day of the trial, describing in detail the circumstances that had led to Jeremiah's death. She spoke calmly and clearly about his violence, his drinking, his plans to abandon her, and the moment when she realized he intended to kill her rather than simply leave. I didn't plan to kill him, she testified. I only wanted to protect myself. But when I saw what I had done, I knew that no one would believe me. A woman has no rights in this country, especially an Irish woman married to a man who owned property. I would have been hanged, regardless of why I killed him. When asked about her decision to dispose of the body, Catherine's voice remained steady, but her eyes filled with tears. I did what I had to do to survive. I'm not proud of it, but I won't apologize for choosing to live. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. The foreman, a tobacco farmer named James Caldwell, read the verdict with visible disgust, and several jury members refused to look at Catherine as the words were spoken. Judge William Pemberton sentenced Catherine to death by hanging, to be carried out on November 30th, 1847. As he pronounced the sentence, he spoke with unusual emotion about the case that had shocked the entire region. Catherine O'Brien, Judge Pemberton said, "You have committed acts that place you beyond the pale of civilized society. While the court acknowledges that you may have initially acted in self-defense, your subsequent actions demonstrate a depravity that cannot be overlooked or forgiven. The manner in which you disposed of your husband's remains represents a violation of every principle of human dignity and Christian burial." Catherine listened to the sentence without visible emotion, but those close enough could see her hands trembling as she was led from the courtroom in shackles. The crowd outside erupted in a mixture of jeers and horrified fascination as news of the verdict spread through Cynthiana. On November 29th, the day before her scheduled execution, Catherine received an unexpected visitor. Father O'Connell came to her cell in the county jail, offering to hear her final confession and provide last rites. Catherine initially refused, but as the evening wore on, she agreed to speak with the priest. "Do you repent of your sins, my child?" Father O'Connell asked as they sat in the dim jail cell. Catherine was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I repent of nothing except being born a woman in a world that offers women no protection," she said finally. "I killed a man who was going to kill me. I disposed of his body because I knew the law would not protect me. If that makes me a sinner in God's eyes, then God and I will have to settle that matter between ourselves. Father O'Connell tried to convince her to seek forgiveness, but Catherine remained adamant that she had done only what was necessary to survive. As he prepared to leave, she asked him for one final favor. "When they hang me tomorrow," she said, "I want you to make sure they bury me properly. Not in the potter's field with criminals and paupers, but in consecrated ground. Whatever else I may have done, I'm still a Catholic woman who deserves Christian burial." Father O'Connell promised to see what he could do, though he warned her that the nature of her crimes might make such arrangements difficult. Catherine O'Brien was hanged at dawn on November 30th, 1847, in the courthouse square in Cynthiana. A crowd of nearly 500 people gathered to witness the execution, many having traveled from other counties to see the end of what newspapers had called the most horrific case in Kentucky history. Catherine walked to the gallows with steady steps, refusing the traditional blindfold and facing the crowd with the same calm determination she had shown throughout her trial. Her last words, spoken clearly enough for all to hear, were, "I die unrepentant for choosing life over death, and survival over submission." The execution was carried out efficiently, and Catherine's body was cut down after hanging for the prescribed time. True to his word, Father O'Connell had arranged for her burial in the Catholic section of Cynthiana's cemetery, though her grave was marked only with a simple wooden cross bearing her initials. The O'Brien farm was seized by the county and eventually sold to pay outstanding debts and court costs. The new owners tore down the pig pen immediately and refused to raise swine on the property, claiming that the land felt cursed for such purposes. The cabin was abandoned and eventually collapsed, leaving only a stone foundation to mark where Catherine and Jeremiah O'Brien had lived out their tragic final chapter. In the months following Catherine's execution, strange stories began to circulate about the former O'Brien property. Local children claimed to hear the sounds of pigs grunting in the woods near the old farm site, though no animals were kept there. Travelers passing by at night reported seeing lights in the windows of the collapsed cabin and catching glimpses of a red-haired woman feeding invisible animals in the darkness. These stories, dismissed by most adults as the product of overactive imaginations, nonetheless persisted for decades. The property changed hands multiple times, with each new owner eventually abandoning it after experiencing what they described as an overwhelming sense of unease that made normal farming impossible. Today, more than 170 years later, the site of the O'Brien farm remains empty land, grown over with trees and underbrush that have reclaimed what was once Catherine's carefully tended garden. Local historians occasionally visit the site, drawn by the enduring mystery of a case that challenged every assumption about the limits of human desperation and survival. The official records of Catherine O'Brien's trial remain in the Kentucky State Archives, filed alongside hundreds of other forgotten cases from the 19th century. But unlike those other cases, Catherine's story continues to resonate with anyone who has ever faced impossible choices and wondered what they might be capable of when survival itself hangs in the balance. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed in that courtroom so long ago, or are there still secrets buried in the Kentucky hills? Leave your comment below with your thoughts about Catherine O'Brien and whether justice was truly served. If you enjoyed this tale of survival and desperation from America's dark past, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves historical mysteries. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another forgotten chapter from our nation's most troubling past.